The war in the Pacific left little space for surrender. Japanese soldiers had been taught since childhood that capture was dishonor, that to fall into enemy hands was worse than death. Women too, nurses, auxiliaries, clerks swept into the tide of battle, carried the same lessons. Yet by 1944, as island after island fell, the unthinkable happened. Groups of Japanese women were captured alive. They were stunned, ashamed, and terrified as they were gathered and transported under guard. They expected abuse. They expected the worst of everything their leaders had warned them about. When the trucks rattled into the camps, their hearts pounded with dread. The fences loomed, the watchtowers looked down, and every step felt like a march toward humiliation. They braced themselves for cruelty. But instead, what they found unsettled them even more. The guards issued blankets. They were assigned bunks in wooden barracks, not cages. Food came in tins, plain but sufficient. Soap was handed out, along with clear rules read in English and repeated in broken Japanese by interpreters. The women looked at one another in confusion. This was not what they had been taught. It felt like stepping into a dream whose logic did not match the stories they had believed. Days took on rhythm. Roll call in the morning, work details, light for the women, mostly sewing, cleaning, or assisting in kitchens, chores in the afternoons. In the evenings, the barracks filled with a silence thick with fear. They whispered of families left behind, of dishonor too great to erase, of uncertainty about what fate awaited them. The guards were present always, rifles slung, boots echoing against the hard ground. Yet their eyes slid away. They kept their distance. Their discipline felt colder than cruelty, as though the women were invisible. Loneliness began to gnaw. The women were young, many barely in their 20s. So, me had left sweethearts behind, others had never known affection. War had stripped them of softness, and captivity stripped them of pride. In the barracks at night, tears fell silently. One nurse wrote secretly in her notebook, "I am not beaten, I am not starved, but I am invisible. This is harder than pain. They do not even see us as women." It was during the long weeks of adjustment that a strange discovery spread among them. Guards rotated on night shifts. Some slept in small huts outside the wire, but others, especially when the barracks were full, when the weather turned bitter, or when a detail required close watch, slept inside, against the far wall or at the entrance. American soldiers unrolled their bedrolls, boots still on, rifles propped within reach, and lay down only yards from the women they were ordered to guard. At first, shock rippled through the prisoners. They had been taught that men in uniform, especially victorious ones, would claim whatever they wished. Yet here were Americans, stretched out on cots or on the floorboards, their backs to the women, their eyes closed in exhaustion, breathing deeply in slumber. Nothing happened. No hands reached out in the dark. No words were whispered. The guards simply slept, as though proximity was unremarkable, as though their self-control was iron. The women whispered fiercely to each other. Could it be a trap? Were they being mocked? One swore that the soldier beside the door had glanced at her deliberately before turning his back, a gesture that left her burning with confusion. Another swore she saw a guard blush when spoken to directly. They argued in hushed tones, unable to understand what it meant. The reality repeated itself, night after night. Guards came, weary from patrols, and laid down within sight and sound of the prisoners. The women huddled, tense, waiting. Yet the men slept as though the prisoners did not exist. To women raised in a culture that saw enemies as demons and conquerors as predators, this indifference was unfathomable. One young auxiliary broke the silence one night. She whispered into the dimness, testing the English she had picked up. "You not afraid?" The guard, half asleep, muttered something she couldn't understand and rolled over. She lay awake until dawn, her heart racing, not from fear but from something stranger, relief mixed with confusion, admiration laced with humiliation. Another night, as frost coated the windows, a guard spread his blanket on the floor closer than usual to the row of bunks. The women stiffened. Hours passed. His breathing steadied, deepened, until it was clear he had fallen into honest sleep. One of the prisoners leaned forward in the dark, staring at the outline of his shoulders, his rifle propped within reach. She whispered later to her friend, "He trusts us not to harm him. He sleeps beside us as if we are harmless. I do not know if I hate him or respect him for this." The diaries that survived tell of this shock more clearly than any memory spoken aloud. A nurse wrote, "They lie down among us with weapons near, but they do not touch. They close their eyes and dream. I waited for the worst. Instead, they showed no desire. It humbles me more than if they had taken what they wished." The guards' discipline unsettled them more than violence would have. Violence could be resisted in the mind, braced against with hate, but indifference broke something deeper. It suggested the Americans saw themselves as bound by rules stronger than desire, rules that placed duty above opportunity. And that discipline, witnessed in the quiet breathing of men asleep on wooden floors, was a power the women had not been taught to imagine. Some of the women began to test the silence. A dropped object, a small cough, a whispered word. The guards rarely stirred. They did not speak in return. When one finally did, it was only to remind them, gently but firmly, to sleep. For the women, the rejection cut sharper than any insult. One confessed to her diary, "I wanted him to look at me just once. He would not. My shame is great, yet also my respect grows. What kind of men are these, who refuse even when we are defenseless?" The paradox spread. Were they despised, so unworthy that they were ignored, or respected, so human that they were spared? The answer lay somewhere in between, and that middle ground tormented them. Weeks blurred into months. Night after night, the same scene unfolded. The clang of gates, the creak of boots, the sigh of guards laying down their rifles, the rhythm of breath in sleep. The women stared at the rafters, listening, hearts heavy with questions they could not answer. Their captivity had stripped them of everything but memory and imagination. And in the strange silence of nights shared with their captors, they began to wonder if the war had lied to them not only about the enemy's strength, but also about his honor. The first shock of capture had not been chains, it had not been blows, it had been this: to lie awake, hearts racing, while American soldiers slept beside them as if they were not temptations, not enemies, but simply people to be guarded until the dawn came. And that realization was more unsettling than any nightmare they had imagined. Part 2. 1,500 words. The cold months dragged on, and with them the silence of the barracks became something heavier than chains. For the Japanese women, the strangeness of captivity was not only in the routines, roll call, rations, sewing work, censored letters never sent, but in the nightly ritual they could not escape. As dusk fell, American guards unrolled their blankets inside the same long room. Rifles leaned against walls, boots thudded against the wooden floor, and within minutes the men were asleep, mere feet from women who had been taught to believe that capture was worse than death. The women had steeled themselves for brutality. Instead, they faced something far harder to grasp: indifference. Not cruel, not dismissive, but disciplined indifference. The Americans lay down and closed their eyes, as if nothing about the arrangement was remarkable. They did not leer, they did not reach, they did not whisper. They slept, and in doing so they unsettled the very foundation of what the women thought they knew about men in war. One nurse, who had hidden a tiny notebook sewn into the hem of her skirt, wrote by candlelight, "I feel invisible. They do not speak to us, they do not harm us, they simply exist beside us as though the line between us is made of stone. I do not know whether to hate this more than cruelty. If they had struck us, I would have clung to hatred. But this is different." At first, the women mistook it for disdain. Perhaps the Americans saw them as beneath notice, unworthy of even a glance, yet that theory frayed quickly. They noticed, in moments too subtle to deny, small gestures that betrayed something other than contempt. A guard who, finding the wind leaking through a broken shutter, nailed a board in place without being asked. Another who turned his back when the women washed their clothes in basins, giving them privacy no one had expected. A third who, half asleep, mumbled good night in halting Japanese, then blushed crimson when one of the women dared to reply. It was not desire. It was something stranger, restraint. And that restraint began to gnaw at the prisoners in ways they could not speak of openly. The older women warned the younger ones not to be fooled. "It is a trick," they whispered. "They want us to lower our guard." Yet night after night, the guards proved the warnings hollow. No tricks followed, only the sound of steady breathing, boots creaking as men shifted in sleep, the occasional low murmur of a dream. The youngest prisoners found themselves confused in ways that frightened them. One 19-year-old auxiliary confessed quietly to a friend, "If he had threatened me, I would know what to feel, but he ignores me. I feel ashamed to wish he would notice me at all." Her words spread like wildfire, whispered and denied, and then admitted again. Many of them felt it. A strange longing not born of attraction, but of the desperate need to be seen as human. The guards, for their part, were hardly unfeeling. Diaries uncovered decades later revealed their own struggle. One soldier wrote, "We are told to watch them always, but watching means temptation. So we look away. They are young, frightened. Some cry themselves to sleep. We pretend we do not hear. It is the hardest thing, not to speak, not to comfort, but rules are rules." The irony was bitter. Both sides mistook the other's silence for rejection, when in truth it was born of discipline. Winter deepened. Rations grew thinner and the barracks colder. The women grew ill, coughing through the nights, curling close for warmth. It was then that the guards began to break their silence in small ways. A soldier slipped a second blanket onto an empty bunk, pretending it had been there all along. Another placed his canteen of warm water within reach. These gestures, quiet and deniable, struck the women harder than speeches ever could. One nurse wrote, "I do not understand. They do not touch us, yet they help us. They do not speak, yet they care in small ways. It is unbearable. I wish they would be cruel, for cruelty I can resist. But this, I cannot." The barracks became a place of contradictions. During the day, the women stiffened their spines, reminding themselves that they were prisoners, enemies, dishonored. But at night, lying awake while American soldiers slept within arm's reach, they wrestled with emotions they had no words for. Resentment battled with admiration. Shame warred with gratitude. It came to a head one night in early spring. A storm hammered the camp, rain drumming on the roof, wind rattling the shutters. Lightning lit the room in harsh flashes. One of the younger women, frightened, let out a small cry in her sleep. A guard near the door stirred, sat up, and looked toward her. For a heartbeat, everyone froze. The women waited for something terrible, the moment they had feared since capture. Instead, the soldier whispered, barely audible, "It's all right." Then he lay back down. Nothing more. No intrusion. Only those 3 words. The silence afterward was heavier than thunder. The women stared into the dark, their hearts pounding, not from fear but from the realization that their captors were capable of gentleness. The nurse who kept the secret notebook wrote the next morning, "They slept beside us again, but now I see it clearly. They do no so, but ignore us. They protect us, even from the dark. What does this mean? What kind of enemy is this?" Word spread among them. They no longer waited in terror for a hand in the night. They waited for nothing at all, and that absence became its own form of presence. They began to measure the Americans not by what they did, but by what they refused to do. And in that refusal, they discovered a discipline that unsettled them more than violence ever could. By the time the cherry blossoms bloomed beyond the fences, the shock of capture had faded into routine. But the nightly ritual never lost its strangeness. Every evening the guards returned, laid their rifles down, stretched out on the floor or against the wall, and closed their eyes. And every night the women lay awake, listening to the breathing of men they had been told were devils, and realizing with a shiver that the devils were more honorable than anyone had dared imagine. It was then that the prisoners began to change. Quietly, without confession, they began to question the stories they had been told. They wondered what else had been lies. They wondered what else might be discovered in silence, in restraint, in the shock of being seen not as spoils, but as fellow human beings. And in that wondering, they began to feel the first flickers of something they had not known since before the war: hope. The war ended suddenly for the prisoners. One day brought the same drills, the same meals, the same watchful guards who rolled out their blankets on the floor of the barracks. The next day, rumors began to ripple through the camp. Japan had surrendered. The empire had fallen. The war was over. For the women, the news struck harder than the clash of armies. To live in defeat was unthinkable. To return home alive was dishonor. Yet there they were, still breathing, still captive, and now no longer even prisoners of war, but displaced women with nowhere certain to go. The Americans did not chain them. They did not mock them. Instead, orders were read. They would be repatriated, even though it might take months before ships could be spared. Until then, they remained in the camps, watched over by the same guards who had slept beside them through the long nights of war. And here the strangest season of captivity began. For with the war over, the silence between guard and prisoner began to thaw. It was not instant. It came slowly, as frost melts under the sun, first in trickles, then in rivulets. One evening, after roll call, a soldier knelt by the stove in the women's barracks to coax the fire back to life. He muttered to himself in English, not realizing that one of the nurses understood enough to reply. "Cold tonight?" she said softly, the words awkward on her tongue. He looked up, startled, and for a long moment neither moved. Then he nodded. "Yes, cold." That was all, but it was the first true conversation. Others followed. A guard taught one woman the English word for bread. Another mimed the action of sewing and thanked them for repairing his torn sleeve. The women who had once refused to meet American eyes now dared to glance, to smile quickly before looking away. And all the while, at night, the ritual continued. The guards slept inside the barracks, their rifles close, their discipline unbroken. The women's diaries from that period are filled with contradictions. "I am grateful, though I should not be," one wrote. "He placed his blanket near me but did not touch. I felt safer than I have in years. Why does this make me feel shame?" Another confessed, "When they lie down, I listen for their breathing. It comforts me, though I despise myself for this weakness. They are the enemy, yet in sleep they are only men." The greatest shock of all came not from what the Americans did, but from what they refused to do. In the ruins of Japan, women faced horrors at the hands of invaders and even their own countrymen. Yet here, in a camp on forage and soil, young soldiers hardened by war chose restraint. They lived their orders, they followed rules, they resisted temptation. And the women, conditioned to expect brutality, found themselves confronted with something more destabilizing: honor. One spring night, rain hammered the tin roof. A guard shifted restlessly, clearly unable to sleep. Finally he sat up, pulled from his pack a harmonica, and began to play. The tune was unfamiliar to the Japanese women, a slow, mournful American hymn. Yet the sound filled the barracks with a strange peace. One woman hummed along, using the melody but shaping it into a lullaby she had learned as a child. The harmony startled them all. Two enemies, two voices, the same song in different tongues. When it ended, silence fell heavy, but it was not hostile silence. It was the silence of people who had shared something fragile and true. The guards never stopped being soldiers. The women never stopped being prisoners. But something invisible had shifted. They were no longer faceless to one another. They were individuals, breathing the same cold air, sleeping in the same cramped barracks, waiting for the same dawn. When the orders finally came for repatriation, the women felt a pang they could not explain. They longed for home, for the soil of Japan, for the families they feared were gone. Yet leaving meant abandoning the strange safety they had found in the unlikeliest of places. Safety not from locks or chains, but from the self-control of men who could have chosen otherwise. The last nights in the camp were the hardest. The guards still unrolled their blankets, still lay down in the same room, still closed their eyes with weapons near at hand. The women stared into the dark, knowing they would never see these men again. One nurse whispered into the silence, "Why?" She did not expect an answer. Yet one of the guards stirred, half asleep, and murmured, "Because it is right." Then he slept again. When the day came, trucks carried the women to the port. They climbed aboard the ships that would take them back across the Pacific. Back to a home that was no longer the same. They stood on deck as the coastline receded, the camp shrinking into memory. Some wept, some clenched their fists in determination. Others simply stared, lost between shame and gratitude. They would never speak of it openly. To admit that their enemies had treated them with restraint, even kindness, was to confess to a crack in the stories their nation had told. But the diaries kept, the whispered memories passed down to daughters and granddaughters, told the truth, that in captivity they discovered not monsters, but men. Men who slept beside them, night after night, and never once reached across the line of honor. Years later, when the war was only history and their own children asked what captivity had been like, the women hesitated. They spoke of hunger, of cold, of fear. They spoke of dishonor. But sometimes, late at night, in voices low enough not to be overheard, they spoke of something else, of American soldiers asleep on the floor of a barracks, of breathing that became a strange comfort, of a harmonica played in the dark, of honor found where they least expected it. That was the shock they carried longer than the war itself, that in the silence of captivity they had seen humanity on the other side of the wire, and though they could not speak it aloud, they never forgot.